this is capitalism. So is this, and this, and this. This is also capitalism. So is this, and this. So why, when people talk about capitalism, is it always this and never this?
Meet Joe, the king of the workers of the world.
Hi, folks.
Joe's the king because he can buy more with his wages than any other worker on the globe. Now, what makes it possible for Joe to earn such a good living? He's no smarter than workers in other countries.
Are you kidding?
He's no stronger than workers in other lands.
Oh, yeah? Well, just watch me.
Sure, being an American is great, but how could you be superior to any foreigner when you or your folks might be any one of a dozen different races or religions? So, if you're no Superman, it must be the American way of doing things that makes you the luckiest guy in the world.
Because pretty much since its inception, capitalists have done an amazing job of propagandizing the system. Now, before you start snapping your phone in half with frustration while screaming what a commie I am, take a second, breathe, and listen. I'm not here to say capitalism is evil or terrible. I'm just here to strip out the propaganda and leave you with a more balanced view. Why? Because for a massive amount of people, it doesn't seem to be working quite as well as it could. Whether people like to admit it or not, the aim of capitalism, as you'll see, is to make a small group of people wealthy at the expense of everyone else. That's literally in its design. That doesn't mean everyone has to be dirt poor. I'm not saying that. Then it doesn't mean that everyone who is rich is evil. I'm not saying that either. Maybe I can illustrate this better with a very simple and 100% true statement. In capitalism, it's possible for anyone to be rich. But it's impossible for everyone to be rich. Its proponents will often say that capitalism raises people out of poverty, a claim which is dubious, as we'll explore. But if that's true, then why is it that Africa, one of the most resource-dense areas in the world, which is also home to the world's largest amount of arable land, is still incredibly poor and starving, despite every single government there being capitalist? The answer is simple. In order for some countries to be rich inside capitalism, it must be at the expense of others being poorer. Because remember, in capitalism, some can be rich, but not everyone. I watched a finance documentary once in which one banker said, money itself is neither won or lost. It's simply transferred from one perception to another. And that is pretty true. Back before the Great Depression, the American public largely trusted corporations and wealthy individuals. And this is mostly because they provided jobs and salaries, and economic conditions were improving year on year. Then, the Great Depression happened, caused at least in part by greedy companies engaging in shady practices to try and benefit from stock market speculation. Suddenly, everyone was poor. Well, except the wealthy. They just stayed wealthy. Everyone else wasn't just poor, they were literally starving to death. And they were starving because a small group of already wealthy people were greedy. Then FDR and labor unions came along and improved conditions for all those people who were starving and suffering. Now, considering just how rabidly resistant to any form of left-wing ideas or socialism Americans are today, I think it's interesting to talk about why those ideas were both suggested and accepted back then. We're going to take a quick and incredibly basic economic history lesson, but I promise that it has a point. Capitalism can raise people from poverty, but it cannot raise everyone from poverty. Whenever you see someone make this point about capitalism eliminating poverty, they will almost always use this graph to demonstrate their point. There's tons of versions of it, and it looks pretty conclusive, right? Or is it? Capitalism is the private ownership of the means of production for the purpose of profit. That's literally the definition as defined by every single source you can find. And that started in the late 16th century in jolly old Great Britain, where agrarianism gave way to capitalism, as lands which were open to the common peasant for personal farming of their own food were suddenly private and illegal to farm. The 16th century is 1501 to 1600. Just in case you didn't know, don't feel bad, I didn't either, and I felt stupid as well. So, now that we know that capitalism begins in the 16th century, what do we notice about this graph? If you were shouting at your phone that it starts at the wrong date, congratulations, you clever sausage, you're right. This graph starts in the 1800s. So, putting aside the fact that ignoring the first 200 years of data is very misleading, and it's kind of suspicious they didn't include it, what did happen in those first 200 years? It's probably just another 200 years of declining poverty, right? Because that's what capitalism does, it eliminates poverty. Except the data doesn't back that up. Here in Italy, we see poverty sharply increase for 200 years, and the same thing happens in India, and the European data shows the exact same trend. People got poorer. Now, for those of you wondering what happened in the USA during this time, it didn't really exist yet. So, if we put these graphs together, we can surmise that capitalism actually led to more poverty. And then suddenly, in 1800, everyone was lifted out of poverty. Now, this prompts two questions. Number one, why did everybody get poorer? And number two, why did they suddenly get richer? The answer to question one is capitalism. The answer to question two is something we're going to come back to. So, prior to capitalism, serfdom was the way the vast majority of people lived who weren't lords. In serfdom, you're legally tied to the land and registered to it, and you must work the fields or mines or whatever generates wealth for the lord. That's the landlord, not the lord. In exchange for being tied to that land and giving lifelong labor, you're given legal and physical protection by the lord of that land, a home to live in, and crucially, you are allowed to farm the land for yourself. Though you would have to pay a percentage of whatever it is that you farmed to the lord as a tax? Which is a bit odd, since aren't rich people famously against taxes? Sounds to me like they're kind of okay with taxes when they're the ones collecting them. But you could be entirely self-sustainable. Most people were. Sure, there were still famines and strife sometimes, but these were largely due to natural occurrences like irregular weather patterns spoiling crops, for example, rather than man-made imposed human conditions. It was restrictive, there's no getting around that, but it was also somewhat mutually beneficial. Capitalism removed access to public lands for personal farming and made it illegal. So the only way to survive was then to find a job and buy food. So prior to capitalism, you could be poor, most people were, but you would be both housed and fed, since it was literally a legal requirement for the lord to provide those things for you under serfdom. After the adoption of capitalism, it wasn't just more possible for people to be starving and homeless, it was a direct and intended effect of it. Because making people homeless and hungry would make them more likely to accept whatever conditions that were offered to them. Now, if we think about it, what happens today is largely the same thing. Some people in society want to remove social safety nets because desperate people will accept whatever terrible jobs and conditions are offered, whereas people who aren't desperate will simply reject it until better terms are proposed. Now, prior to the establishment of capitalism, people stopped working once they had enough food to eat. I mean, there were little to no consumer products and people lived almost entirely based on need instead of wants like we do today. There was no need to work longer hours because if you weren't hungry, then what was the point? And the boss couldn't just deny you the food because it was illegal. That removal of common grounds and restricting it to only the asset-owning class meant the only way to get fed was to do whatever the asset owner wanted. It literally forced them to not only work, but to work far longer and far harder than they really wanted to.
Nobody wants to work anymore.
No shit. This is perhaps the single dumbest criticism of individual behavior. Nobody ever wanted to work. That's why wages exist. To persuade someone to go to a place they didn't want to go to do a task that they didn't want to do at a time that they didn't want to do it because someone else wanted them to do it. To give you an idea of just how stark the difference is between before and after capitalism, consider that before it, medieval workers in Britain enjoyed 51% of their annual calendar as leisure time. That was because when your food and housing needs are met, there's really no reason to work. So people enjoyed time with family, they went fishing, hiking, they played with their kids, and they existed as dual parent families. That's when two parents participate in raising the children, not just one or sometimes none. This was great for average Joe's work-life balance, but it was a bit shitty for rich people who wanted to be way more richer. Fast forward through 100 years of capitalism and suddenly they were forced to work much longer.
They're not forced, it's an agreement between two people and it's mutually beneficial.
No, it's not. When one party literally starves if they don't accept the shitty terms that are offered and the other party doesn't starve if the terms aren't accepted, then it's not an equal and fair bargain at all. It's closer to a ransom. If the two parties negotiating don't have bargaining parity, then it is not a free and fair exchange. Then, industrial capitalists adopted mechanical clocks in their factories and combined with artificial lighting, they reduced that leisure time from 51% to a genuinely shocking 15%, which is where it sits today pretty much. That meant that of the 365 available days, people were working about 310 of them. They installed those clocks for timekeeping so that people turned up on time. And you might think that that benefits the workers too, since if they knew when to arrive on time, they also knew when to go home on time. Except the factory owners often cheated. They would turn the clocks backwards during work hours, increasing the amount of time spent working. And when it was break time, they would set the clock back to its normal time, decreasing the amount of break time that people had. Sneaky fucks. Because timekeeping was genuinely a brand new concept at the time, people really didn't notice what was happening. Like, people just weren't used to tracking time. You have to remember that prior to this point in history, people dictated time based on things like the available light outside or the seasons. It was a far more loose concept. But as pocket watches became a thing, suddenly people noticed that the factory clock didn't match up to their pocket watch, and they realized they were getting scammed. The factory owners held up their hands and said, "You got us. We're really sorry, and it'll never happen again." Just kidding. They fired anyone who came to work with a pocket watch, claiming that it was a distraction. These things meant that people were working 80% more hours, which definitely made some people in Britain way richer. But average Joes were getting poorer, as the data shows. This is partly why using GDP alone as a measure of state health is at best a very, very blunt tool. It ignores the people who are starving on one end of the spectrum and the ultra rich who have got way more than they need on the other end of the spectrum, and gives the impression that everyone is doing okay. I mean, averages always hide the extremes of data. Now, if you're talking about the efficiency of a computer, for example, then it's fine to use averages. But when you're literally talking about starving people, it's a little unethical to use an average to give the impression they're doing okay when they're actually starving. For example, if we measure the prosperity of a family by the household income and dad makes $1 million a year, you would assume that it's a very wealthy family. But if dad never feeds the kids or spends money on them at all and they're literally starving to death, then the household income would be a very bad way to measure the wealth of the people inside that family. Now, the idea that people were getting poorer and poverty was increasing is backed up by a few studies which show that average height declined steadily during the introduction of capitalism. Average height is often used as a measure of health and therefore wealth too. If a population is well fed and catered for, average height either stays the same or increases. When they're poor and malnourished, it decreases. The same thing happened with life expectancy, and these are two things that you would expect to get better as poverty decreases. Also, just a quick side note, we see something interesting when we look at South America. See, South America actually prospered until the 1800s, when people's living standards and wealth suddenly took a massive nosedive. So why is it reversed there? Well, capitalism didn't arrive in the South Americas until the 1800s. So the introduction of capitalism literally made people poorer everywhere that it happened. So that's why everyone got poorer for 200 years. But what about question 2? Why did everyone suddenly get more wealthy? Well, the Industrial Revolution happened, which did raise living standards via increased and more efficient production of many different things. And some people would say that that's probably a result of capitalism, and you can make that argument. I'm not going to make that argument today, but you can make it. But another very significant thing happened in the post-1800 period, and that was increased government. In Britain, during the 1600s, when capitalism was first introduced, Queen Elizabeth's government, seeing the amount of poor and starving people increasing every single year since they introduced capitalism, created the Poor Law, which sort of loosely and politely said it'd be kind of nice if people who were wealthy took care of the people who were poor. But it was not strictly enforced in the beginning. During serfdom, it was kind of easy to punish lords who didn't take care of the people that were tied to their land because there was literally a register of them. But with capitalism, people could just claim those poor people were from anywhere else and escape legal punishment and obligation. In fact, the freedom of movement created by capitalism, and yes, it did create that freedom, actually made it much easier for capitalists to evade punishment for allowing people to starve, because now they could just say, hey, these aren't my people, these just wandered here from somewhere else. Now, over time, as capitalism exacerbated this issue, the law was more strictly enforced and spending on poor relief increased dramatically. Poor relief in Elizabethan Britain was a system of taxation which was then redistributed to the poor people to stop them from starving to death. Why did they want to stop that? Well, it's simple. It reduced the amount of crime and criminals. It lowered social unrest, and back then social unrest quite often resulted in revolutions and civil wars against their own monarchs and governments, so they were kind of keen to stop that from happening. In 1600, expressed as a percentage of GDP, spending on the poor was under 1%. By 1800 it was over 2%, and poverty had begun to sharply decline. Countries around Europe were doing the exact same thing and having the exact same results. And the answer was pretty clear. Capitalism needed guardrails, and taxing the wealthy to redistribute amongst the poor in the form of clothes, food and housing alleviated both absolute and relative poverty. Sorry guys, capitalism didn't lift people out of poverty. Socialism, well, its 17th century equivalent, did. So what happened next? Well, people realised what a great tool for equality socialism was, and that it made the entire country healthier both economically and physically, and it became the de facto system for the whole world.
That's bait.
The British wealthy, they started to get annoyed about helping poor people, and they lobbied for the creation of the workhouse, whereby poor people would literally be forced to work if they wanted to be fed even scraps of food. That lobbying was successful with the passing of the New Poor Law in 1834, which made it illegal to give a poor person help without first sending them to the workhouse for some hard labour. It literally made charity illegal. The workhouse is actually a way more benign sounding name than what it really was, which was slave labour in ultra shitty conditions. Take a look. Look at the smiles on their faces as they receive all this capitalism, making their lives better, reducing the poverty. I mean, look at how wealthy all these people are as their poverty is reduced by the magnificence of capitalism. This was actually a reversal of Elizabeth I's Poor Law, which made it illegal to allow someone to starve when you had the capacity to prevent it. Now, it was illegal to help a starving person unless they were sent to the workhouse. And wait, was Elizabeth still in charge by that point? I don't even know. Let's check, because it seems kind of weird that she would reverse one of her own, very successful ideas. No, Vicky was in charge by that point. Seemed like Lizzie kind of cared about the poor, and everyone that came after definitely didn't. It's worth noting that the only people who were in favour of this law were the workhouse owners and capitalists. It was universally despised by everyone else, and many news reports at the time repeatedly labelled it as a prison for poor people. Rather ironically, when people talk about this now, they frame it as a failure of socialism. People use it as a demonstration of how wealth redistribution is a bad thing. In reality, this is almost pure capitalism. I mean, slavery is capitalism in its purest form. And this is like 90% pure capitalism. The aim was to stop poor people from claiming poor relief. If they couldn't change the fact that they were forced to give to the poor, they could sure as shit influence the poor into not wanting to claim it. Sounds kind of familiar to today, right? By the late 19th century, modern capitalism, sometimes called Capitalism 1.0, was en vogue and was based mostly around the ideals of laissez-faire capitalism. That is, the totally unregulated, rampant capitalism that we started with that made everybody poorer. All of the acts, laws and regulations which had been put in place to alleviate poverty were slowly removed and rolled back, and capitalists had free rein again. And this led us to a great period of massive prosperity and world harmony. Actually, it led us to the Great Depression, and neatly back to where we started. I told you it would be relevant, even if I did take you around the houses first. So public mood largely stems from the perception of who is improving their lives. As capitalism had just sent most people back to pre-industrial standards because of their rampant and sometimes illegal stock market speculation, all for greed, public trust in corporations and capitalism was at an all-time low. Everyone knew two things: their lives sucked harder than Bonnie Blue, and wealthy companies and people were the reason why. Then, in 1933, this chap was voted into the office of presidency. I'd argue he's probably the greatest president the USA has ever had, but who am I to judge? I'm not even American. Roosevelt rolled into office and within 100 days created the SEC to stop illegal insider trading, the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Tennessee Valley Authority, both of which created thousands of jobs, the Emergency Banking Act, again to stop market manipulation, and the collection of other legislation which came to be known as the New Deal. The purpose of all this new stuff was to make poor people less poor and also get them back at work again. People called it radical, and they kicked and they screamed that this would destroy America. When I say people, I mean rich people. Everyone else was kind of grateful as it made their lives materially better. These policies helped, but he didn't think that they helped quite enough, so he created a second wave of policies called the Second New Deal in 1935. This one contained things like the Social Security Act, which guaranteed the unemployed, the disabled and the elderly an income. The Fair Labor Standards Act, which made employing children illegal and enshrined the 40-hour work week as the legal maximum, and also created the national minimum wage. And crucially, he also created the National Labor Relations Act, which gave everyone the legal right to unionize. Prior to this act, attempts to unionize had been met with actual violence, and workers were literally murdered when they tried. Like with the Homestead strike, when Andrew Carnegie hired the Pinkertons to literally murder striking workers, whilst publicly stating that he was in favour of the striking workers. Or maybe the Haymarket affair of 1886, where police opened fire on striking workers, killing 2 and injuring many others. Now suddenly, workers had the right, the legal right to strike and organise without fear of literally being murdered. The US recovery from the Great Depression was hampered a little bit by a small European skirmish with a famous Charlie Chaplin fan. Yo, just a quick interlude. Who the fuck said that I looked like Hitler in the last video? Where the hell did that come from? Upon conclusion of that little disagreement, domestic life began to return to normal. Now, during the war, auto workers had been reassigned to making the tools of war, and conditions and pay had been frozen whilst that was happening. Now, it was unfrozen and workers could also unionize, and that's exactly what happened. The United Auto Workers Union went on strike at Chrysler, costing them $1 billion in lost sales after they refused to negotiate. This pushed GM to then offer full pensions and a wage pegged to the cost of living to avoid the same thing. Other industries followed suit, and suddenly the average Joes of America were being paid a reasonable wage. And what people found was that rich people still got richer anyway, since average Joe now had the money to buy their goods and services. This is called Trickle-Up Economics, and I'll bet you don't hear that phrase too often, if ever. I took high school economics and I often read it in my spare time because I'm a loser, but it's pretty much never discussed anywhere, not even in the lefty economics textbooks. Thanks to FDR and his New Deal policies, and in addition to the labour unions and their victories, living standards increased and wealth inequality lessened in the longest and most stable period of economic improvement in American history. It is still today the longest and most stable period of economic improvement in American history. But it also meant less opportunity for greed, as the government heavily regulated pretty much everything and expanded social programs in an effort to rebalance the wealth inequality. FDR also created a 75% wealth tax on the highest earners. Now today, if you mention the words wealth tax, you'll immediately get some dickheads screaming about capital flight. But if you check, and I did, no capital flight occurred after FDR created a wealth tax. In fact, the only example that people ever give of capital flight is Norway 2024 when they introduced a wealth tax. But actually, at the time of recording this video, the tax revenue figures for 2024-25 haven't been released by Norway yet. So anyone who says Norway lost money during this year because of capital flight either doesn't understand or is being dishonest. We don't actually know what the effects are as of the time of this video. There are literally no other examples of capital flight negatively affecting an economy after the creation of wealth taxes or the increase of existing taxes. France and Spain have both increased taxes on the wealthy, and there's no evidence of capital flight. Everywhere you look, it's people writing opinion pieces or creating stories. There's no objective data that supports the fact that capital flight happens. From as far as I can tell, it is yet another myth. Those top earners claim that this new wealth tax would crash the economy and bankrupt America, which was pretty rich, coming from the group of people who had just crashed the economy and bankrupted America. There was an economist once called Hyman Minsky who had an interesting theory which I happen to agree with. He argued that financial markets in a capitalist system are inherently unstable and require government intervention to keep them stable. Putting it as simply as I can, he said that we have periods of strict regulation which results in long, stable economic growth. Then people argue for the removal of those regulations, claiming that the system doesn't need it anymore because it's been stable for such a long time. And those regulations are just like holding us back, man. Then those restrictions are removed and the market becomes unstable as people take greater risks and corruption increases, and eventually the market crashes. At which point the government steps in and starts the cycle all over again. Minsky was proposing this theory way back in the early 60s, specifically to try and explain economic crashes. See, back then he was largely ignored as the only point of reference was the Great Depression, and people just assumed that it was a unique event. Given that after it there was 25 years of stable growth, people just assumed it was a one-off. The only financial crisis in the US after FDR's reforms were in the 70s due to Arab nations suddenly stemming the flow of oil into countries which supported Israel, causing the oil shocks. However, I know you guys hate it when I dig at Jimmy Carter, but Jimmy Carter did start the unwinding of regulations in the 70s. Now, not saying he was the great deregulator, that was Ronnie Reagan. But Jimmy Carter did start it, and then Reagan came in and said regulations needed to go. His cabinet said, which ones? And he said, yes. Following that, we had the savings and loan crisis of 86, Black Monday in 89, a minor recession in 90, the dot-com bust of the late 90s. And these should all have been warning signs, but Clinton set fire to key banking regulations in the mid-90s, and the result would be another crash, similar to the Great Depression on scale, in 2008, which we're all familiar with. So, it does kind of seem like Minsky was dead on. Before each and every crash, it's always preceded by a period of deregulation, and each period of stable growth is always preceded by increased regulation. And when viewed with a historical context, that's exactly what happened prior to the Great Depression too. We had 16 to 1700s where there was zero regulation and everyone got poorer. Then 17 to 1800 when regulation was increased and poverty decreased quite a lot. Then the late 1800s to the early 1920s where regulation was pretty much stripped away to nothing again, and we got the Great Depression. Minsky argued for more government intervention, stricter regulation, and concentrating less private debt in financial markets. All ideas which, whenever implemented, lead to periods of stability and wealth equality, but much less opportunity for greed. Incidentally, these are all things which China instituted in their economy throughout their many reforms and led to China being the economic powerhouse that it is today. In fact, China is another example of capitalism increasing poverty, as they instituted a bunch of capitalist-based market reforms in the 90s, and extreme poverty actually increased. Prior to these reforms, Chinese people controlled the land that they lived on and simply paid a 25% tax of their farming produce to the government. They were self-sufficient, and just like in Europe, after these reforms, the share of assets concentrated in the hands of smaller group of private individuals greatly increased and poverty remained unchanged, despite the fact that GDP increased by 300%. Now, if the maxim that capitalism decreases poverty were true, then as GDP increased by 300%, we should see a similar decrease in poverty, but actually, it remained largely unchanged. Without regulation and control, capitalism is an inherently unstable system, and it should have been quite obvious really, because it focuses, rewards, and intensifies the greed of individuals, and their greed often runs contrary to the running of a country or the needs of its people. I mean, think about it. Every time there is a failure of capitalism, like an economic crash, it isn't the blinding efficiency of the free market which fixes the problem. It's government intervention. Great Depression, heavy regulation and taxation. 2008, bailouts. Even something like a pandemic is a problem which without the government, capitalism would not be able to solve. Actually, it wouldn't even attempt to solve it. It's true that private industry created the vaccine, but it did so with government subsidy money, and because the government paid for everyone's vaccination via taxes in advance. Pharma didn't give it out for free. If we remove the government from that particular equation, then it's unlikely that pharma ever develops the vaccine, because pharma companies would not want to invest billions of dollars in a new novel drug which they may never make a profit from because the population can't afford it. The government guaranteed them a profit by both part funding the development of the drug and also by paying for the doses to be delivered to people. And they still jacked up the price enormously as well. As an example of what I mean, check out this video, which talks about how capitalism would have killed the discovery of penicillin, in which one of the discoverers of penicillin himself describes how it could only happen because it was exploratory and curiosity-based science, which wasn't looking for a particular marketable application, which is the sole purpose of capitalist pharma. I'm going to link it below. It is genuinely a really interesting video.
And he was finally encouraged to go to medical school. Also, Ernst Chain, the main guy in charge at that Oxford lab, published a remembrance of his time at Oxford. And he wrote, That penicillin could have practical use in clinical medicine did not enter our minds when we started our work on it. A substance of the degree of instability that penicillin seemed to possess, according to the published facts, does not hold out much promise for clinical application. If my working hypothesis had been correct and penicillin had been a protein, its practical use as a chemotherapeutic agent would have been out of the question because of anaphylactic phenomena that inevitably would have followed its repeated use. From the scientific point of view, however, the problem of purifying penicillin and isolating the substrate on which I thought it acted was of interest and hence well worth pursuing. He goes on to say, I started to work on penicillin in 1938, long before the outbreak of the war. The frequently repeated statement that the work was started as a contribution to the war effort to find a chemotherapeutic agent suitable for the treatment of infected war wounds has no basis. The only reason that motivated me was scientific interest. I very much doubt whether I would have been allowed to study this problem at that time in one of the so-called mission-oriented, practically minded industrial laboratories. The research on penicillin, which was started as a problem of purely scientific interest but had consequences of very great practical importance, is a good example of how difficult it is to demarcate sharp limits between pure and applied research. That's right, one of the guys who is most responsible for the production of penicillin during World War II directly contradicts Hassenfelder's statements, making it crystal clear that his team's hypothesis was that this substance had no practical medical use, and therefore no interest to a capitalist who might buy or sell it.
The things which the free market can resolve are only things which a profit can be skimmed off of. This is why, despite being the most capitalist country in the world, with supposedly the freest markets in the world, the USA has homeless people and people in poverty. Because capitalism doesn't solve the problems of society, it mostly creates and satisfies consumer demand. When it solves a societal problem, that's usually a side effect of capitalism rather than its intention. Like with the pandemic example. Capitalism causes intentional strife. Its supporters say that capitalism is the fairest system because people get what they work for. Which isn't really true, but let's assume that it is. When you point out that people who aren't capable of working get left behind by the system, like the disabled, what do capitalists say about the fact that the system does leave them behind? Well, suddenly it doesn't matter about fairness because life isn't fair. This is why capitalism not just permits, but also incentivizes things like denying medical care. That's beneficial to capitalist owners, but it's detrimental to the health of a country because it means the workers are less healthy and therefore less productive, which is bad for the country, but it's wicked for the business. I mean, think back to the history that we opened up with for this video. Capitalism removed and criminalized your ability to be self-sustaining as a method of control to coerce you into working for their benefit. Because if you can feed yourself, well, you don't need to work. Capitalism is built around this concept of ring-fencing things that people need in order to prod them into working more hours for less reward. The nature of the employer-employee relationship in capitalism is an adversarial one by nature. The employer wants to reduce the cost of labor as much as possible, ideally to zero, and the employee wants to increase the cost of labor as much as possible. Now, I want you to consider a really simple question. If capitalism eliminates poverty, then why does poverty still exist in capitalist countries? If capitalism eliminated poverty, there would be no poverty. In closing, I didn't draw all this info together to say that capitalism is bad. It isn't bad or good. It's a tool for managing a country, and it shouldn't be some heavily worshipped religion. It has some uses to serve non-essential consumer demand, but it also has its limitations. Can it be used to make people's lives better? Sure. But capitalism is highly mythologized, especially in the United States, where people generally believe regulation is a bad thing. And I just want people to view it more realistically and to be more open-minded to the idea of giving strict controls to capitalism. Instead of you working for capitalism, make capitalism work for you. Спасибо за просмотр, comrades.